one is on Powering the Future, Youth and Sweden's New Nuclear Roadmap. So for those of you who don't know, a few weeks ago, Sweden released a new roadmap that featured bold ambitions around deploying nuclear energy across the country. I am going to start with introducing our panelists and then we'll jump right in. So with me today, we have Aanstoot on the end there. She is a campaign leader for Dear Greenpeace. She's a young climate activist that has been championing nuclear power as a climate solution and created the Dear Greenpeace campaign, asking the global environmental organizations to drop its old-fashioned and unscientific opposition to nuclear power. We also have Simon Wakter here next to me, who is a nuclear engineer and co-founder of the Swedish Ecomodernists. Those who joined us for the last panel will recognize him and give us an opportunity to dive a little bit more into the topics around Sweden that we weren't able to get to in the last one. Simon has a Master's of Science in Nuclear Energy Engineering with a background in nuclear safety and licensing. We also have Daniel Westlén, the State Secretary for the Ministry of Climate and Enterprise for the Kingdom of Sweden. Daniel was appointed State Secretary in 2022 after serving in the Secretariat of the Liberal Party since 2020. He has a long history of working in the energy field, including working at Vattenfall, a leading European energy company, Marx Kraft Group, a provider of electricity from nuclear power, and the Swedish Center for Nuclear Technology, just to name a few. So thank you to our three panelists for joining us today. I'm actually going to start off by kicking it to you, Daniel, to tell the group a bit of an update of what has changed in Sweden's plan around nuclear. What does the roadmap that was just released include?
Okay, so recent events are that during the former government that served for 8 years, we lost 4 of our 10 nuclear reactors in our country. The background to this is that people took electricity and cheap electricity for granted. Electricity had been there since the 80s when we built the nuclear power plants, and it had never been an issue and it had never been expensive. So people used electricity as they use the air they breathe, basically. It was used for everything, and the industry benefited from low prices comparatively. When we lost the 4 reactors, all of this changed, and the southern part of the country got very high prices, which were heavily influenced by the continental European prices, which in turn were raised quite significantly with the gas crisis following Russia's terrible invasion of Ukraine. Now, this coincided with the elections, and I claim that this was a major reason why we shifted the government. People realized that the policy that we have been having for many years had to be changed, and we had to start focusing on physics. How does the electricity system work? What makes electricity come to the socket, and what decides the price of electricity? All of a sudden, people started caring about electricity and the prices of electricity, and people realized that we need dispatchable capacity. Now we can't expand hydropower, we can't really expand biomass either, because we need the biomass for more productive things than burning it, and we don't really have any other choices for dispatchable capacity. So that led to the government's plan to expand nuclear. We use the phrase massive expansion, and by this we mean at least corresponding to 2 full-size reactors by 2035, and then 10 of them in the 40s. So this is indeed a massive expansion. It's a tripling of the Swedish capacity, which we will need to electrify industry and the transport sector in a way that obeys to Kirchhoff's laws for how the power system works.
And this is quite a change for Sweden. I was reading that back in 1980, there was a plan to phase out nuclear. And so this, along with the recent announcement in, I believe, June of earlier this year, where the cabinet switched the 100% renewable energy target by 2045 to a 100% fossil fuel-free electricity target by 2045, shows this significant progress and change in the support for nuclear. I want to actually turn to Simon to comment on this. You've been tracking this transition for a while, for example, being on the board of the Swedish Nuclear Society and co-founding the Swedish Ecomodernists Association. What have you seen as far as this transition, and can you comment on the role of the youth in particular and how the change around nuclear power has occurred in Sweden?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first expansion of nuclear power allowed us to electrify heating of homes, phase out fuel oil. In the late 1980s, we were pretty much done with fossil-free electricity and heating. Then we thought that we would not use any more electricity, so all the plans for how much electricity we'd use didn't come true, and we ended up using around 140 terawatt hours, and that has been stable now for the past 20 years. What has changed now is the need to electrify transportation and industry, and with that we see plans, and these are the government plans too, that we're going to require around 300 terawatt hours, so it's a doubling of Swedish electricity production until 2045. And I think it's with this urgency that we have gone from this quite privileged discussion of choosing between different energy sources and optimizing the energy mix that we thought would never change. So we thought we could build some more wind, or we can have some more nuclear, and it was a discussion around the steady state, but that's no longer the case. Now we're in a situation where we need to massively expand the power system, and we also had the crisis of how the grid operates, the electricity price crisis, and that has also fueled this new thinking, I think.
Yeah, it's nice to see a country and a government really understanding the sheer challenge around scale of clean energy build-out that's necessary to meet our climate goals. You mentioned the tripling of electricity capacity. I'm realizing I also failed to introduce myself. I'm Lindsay Walter. I am the Director of International Policy for Third Way, and at our company, our nonprofit that we work for, we do some energy systems analysis, and one of the biggest challenges that we always see when working with governments and providing analysis for them is trying to communicate the increase in electric capacity that will occur. And there's often this misunderstanding that if we're going to reduce energy demand overall because of improvements in efficiency and demand response, why then is there this complementary increase in electric capacity? And that's a hard thing for policymakers to get. So it's great to see Sweden getting it right. I want to bring Ia into the conversation because the youth movement has been huge here. And I want to, for those of you who don't know, Ia had a really impressive role last year in COP, taking the initiative to head to Egypt on your own under the banner of Nuclear for Climate, and thanks to your on-the-ground work and activism, got it to the attention of the U.S. Department of Energy under Katie Hoff, and ultimately changed some language in the final version to include nuclear. So you have firsthand experience showing how impactful it can be for younger generations to be on the ground. Can you talk about what motivated you to start the Greenpeace campaign, how you've measured that success, and what role do you think it has played, if any, in Sweden's transition?
Well, first of all, I think my motivation is very simple, as I think is the motivation of all youth climate activists. I would like a planet to live on. And I could technically just end it there, but I do want to expand on it. And I want to say that I think that what is important, especially for youth engagement, is that it's not only about the change we make, but about learning to engage in civil society and learning to engage in policy and in politics and in the decision-making progress, and to get used to these hectic and often chaotic spheres that are international and national decision-making processes, and to simply learn how to navigate them at a young age, I think is really important. And then I think it's important to note that sometimes old people just need a young person to say, "What the fuck?" And that's what we're here for, you know? Sometimes that's needed, and I get it. You're like, oh, but I have 90 other things to care about, and my email inbox is overflowing, and there's no coffee in the office. I don't know what adults care about, but you get my point. And then sometimes you just have to have someone that comes and says, hey, could we stop the planet from burning up, please? That's priority one here, I feel. I think that's where the youth activism comes in, and I think that's where youth activism also has its largest potential, that it can really display a more human side of issues that are very often reduced to numbers and figures and economies.
I appreciate it because this panel is, yes, about Sweden's energy transition, but it's also about the role of youth in driving that transition as well as the benefits of Sweden's clean energy transition. I want to go back to you, Daniel. You were a council member of the Swedish Association of Graduate Engineers from 2006 to 2018. So you have a lot of knowledge about what high-level skills and expertise are needed in the energy field. How is and what is Sweden doing to attract incomers into the workforce, in particular the nuclear energy workforce, and what is the opportunity for young people to enter nuclear industry in Sweden?
I also worked a lot in the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. I was on the board of the university, and I was as a student actively following some of the student politics and university politics within the university. And what was very striking is that depending on how politics talks about nuclear, you got immediate effects in the applications for the graduate courses in nuclear technology and nuclear engineering. And this is a very fast effect, so you can really use this as a leading indicator on what's going on. And by changing the language from the government, you can double or triple or even have 5 times as many students to the course next semester. So this, I think, is the fastest and most important signal that the government can send to young people looking for what to study. The kind of optimism that the government sends and that the grown-ups send to young people has an immediate impact. Well, maybe the youth is a bit short-sighted looking at what's been said the last couple of months, but I really saw that effect. So an advice to young people is to consider longer perspectives, maybe 20 or 40 or even 60 years, which I guess you do in your drive for climate.
Yeah, do you think the youth
among
is
importance, yeah,
It's hard to not be short-sighted. I haven't even lived 20 years.
Sorry, continue, Daniel.
That would be the most important short-term thing to increase the attractiveness of nuclear education.
Yeah. When we talk about the benefits of the clean energy transition, jobs is a key component. Certainly in the United States, where I'm from, that's all the Biden administration is talking about when it comes to clean energy. But the other important piece is this economic competitiveness component. And I was reading some technology roadmaps in Sweden for specific technologies, highlighting how it will create economic opportunity in the country. Simon, I'm wondering if you can comment on where the nuclear energy industry and the future of the nuclear energy industry in Sweden provides opportunities for Sweden to be more competitive globally.
Yeah, I mean, energy has a completely fundamental role in all of Swedish society. It has formed politics because the access to clean, cheap electricity is what has formed the foundation to afford high wages for the industry, to afford high pension payments, and which also affords us to take great care of nature, because you can only really do that when you have the resources to do it. So in that way, the access to clean and cheap electricity has been completely fundamental in shaping Swedish society.
I want to switch gears for a second and talk a bit more about the youth piece with Ia, since she got dinged by Daniel on not thinking long term, despite her number one goal, trying to make sure there's a livable planet, which feels a little bit long term to me, in all fairness. Another thing that stands out to me about Sweden is that the current Minister for Climate and the Environment is 28 years old and is really inspiring to see how the support of younger generations is a big contributor to the growth of nuclear energy. Can you speak a little bit more about how the youth in Sweden view nuclear energy specifically, and do you think it differs from other countries, particularly in the surrounding region?
I mean, it's like the Swedish population as a whole is quite positive towards nuclear power. Last I checked, it was over 50% that were for an expansion of nuclear power, and nearly 90% that were pro continuing with the current. So it is, the statistics are looking good on the population as a whole, and that is it's reflected in the youth as well, of course. And I would even say that it looks better there. since there might be less dogmas around nuclear power in the younger generation. But it's also worth mentioning that I do feel like there has been a lack of education on it. Like, I went to a science program in high school, and we talked about nuclear power twice in those 3 years. And the friends I had that didn't go to either science or technology had nuclear power mentioned once in their entire compulsory education, and that was it. So a lot of the people that I meet with my age, they're like, oh yeah, I think we have that. And that's about the extent of their knowledge of nuclear power. So I do think there's a lot that can be done there. But I do think that the people that are like active and engaged in the energy and in the environmental space, they are very often either pro-nuclear, or they are unsure, but they understand that it's obviously a better choice than fossil fuels, and that we made a bad choice by turning them off, since we are having to resort to worse measures now.
Simon, as an eco-modernist, and I'm going to clarify prerequisite background on this question, eco-modernism in the United States sometimes can get a little bit of a bad rap. It can sometimes be viewed as a technologically, we're going to find the solutions through technology, therefore we don't have to do other components. And I've even seen attempts to rebrand eco-modernism in Europe. I'm curious how you think the brand lands with young people and whether it reaches this younger audience.
Well, I'm unsure about the branding and the people's perspective on the branding, but what we find when we discuss eco-modernism and like the values and our goals is that pretty much everyone is like an undercover eco-modernist, because our goals are like good, healthy lives for everyone and sustainability with regards to environment and climate. It's difficult not to agree with that. Then what I find when I talk to other activists that maybe come from what I would call maybe a more deep green background, is that we often share perspectives on many technologies as well, but we come at it from a slightly different angle. So where you come from like an anti-consumerism background, like you shouldn't drive an SUV because it's consumerism and it's bad, we come at it from the side where it's just nicer to live in walkable cities where we don't subsidize parking on the streets and where you can get where you want to be on a bike or public transport. So it's the same. So we share their view. We need like more walkable cities, for example, but we come at it from a different angle. And I think the positive spin from our angle is very helpful in like attracting people to it, because it has it's a narrative that offers a better view of the future. And I think the hope that vision instills is very important to get people inspired, because when you talk this doomerism way, it is difficult to people. They stop listening. They don't want to listen to it, so it's difficult to get them engaged.
It's good to hear that perspective, because certainly we need to be broadening the coalition that is supportive of bold climate action, and as we've seen, even some political shifts, even more towards populist governments and to the right, keeping climate energy as a broad topic that people can come at it from different angles, whether it's a technology focus or an economic and job focus or an environmental, conservatism focus. These are all important angles. I have a couple more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. That way, anyone who does have a question can get an opportunity while we still have time. So does anyone in our audience have a question for our panelists? Please.
I had a question.
Let's give you a mic.
I had a question on the last panel, and then he didn't want to answer it because said they would answer it on this panel, so I guess...
Can you please remind us what it was?
Oh, snap. It's almost like I forgot. Yes, it was when it came to arguing for keeping this system, right? There were arguments politically that was like, no, we should shut it down. What I was curious to understand, what was the key arguments that were being used to kind of drive this change? I think that was it, right? Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Simon, we'll start with you, and Daniel, I'd like your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, so we spoke about it briefly in like the intermission between the panels, and I think one aspect to it is that we had a system, like I said, that wasn't expanding in the amount of electricity we were using, etc. So, and when we were expanding nuclear power, it was like this societal building mission, really, that everyone was behind. Then, in lack of such a mission, we started this discussion on like, I prefer wind, or I prefer solar, or I prefer nuclear, which was kind of like a distraction because we lacked any bigger goal. Now we have this bigger goal of electrifying industry, transport, getting fossil free, which I really think changes the discussion. But as for the arguments we heard, I think it was because when we had this discussion, people had to also politically profile themselves, because that was the only way that you had any difference between political parties with regards to the energy system, because we weren't really doing much. So saying you liked wind was like your political identification then, and once you've invested that political capital, you can come up with any number of nonsense arguments to support that, because it's like a sunk cost. Now you have to go with it.
Great. Daniel, do you want to chip in on this one?
Well, it's actually not political anymore. It's physics, because it's all about rebuilding a robust and resilient system. We don't really even know if we can turn the power system back on after a major blackout in Sweden today. Last time it happened, back in 1983, it took 1 hour to reconnect the system, and 6 hours before 7 million people that lost the power got it back again. But now we don't really know how long time it will take, or if it's really even possible. Hopefully it's possible. Now, so there's this notion that it's very important that politicians reach a compromise and agree on things, and broad compromises. In Sweden, this is fundamental in politics. As long as there is a broad compromise, everybody believes that it's going to be stable, and then they can start investing or whatever. Now, it doesn't matter what we agree upon unless it applies to the laws of physics. And that's where we are, actually, that we can more or less say what's going to work and what's not going to work, and many of the compromises that we may be able to reach will not work physically, and we will have to redo them again, so they're not going to be stable.
Yeah, just to add in to what Daniel said, so when the political parties were profiling themselves in this way, the only way to like agree on doing anything was like this broad agreement. But to get a broad agreement that everyone agrees on is really like least denominator kind of agreement that doesn't achieve much, and of course that led us to where we are today. But fortunately now, like Daniel said, we've kind of gotten out of that, so I think we're taking the politics out of the energy system.
A key factor to durable policy around nuclear energy. We've seen it in the US. It's one of the few issues that Republicans and Democrats can actually agree upon. So if you have that durable support and it becomes non-political, I know just how impactful that can be.
I think you both are being very optimistic about the Swedish political system right now, because I'm not seeing this by I don't want to say bipartisan, because it's not bipartisan in Sweden, but like I'm not seeing this wide spread support the same way you guys are. I'm sure it's because we are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but still, I don't think we're there yet. I think we have a bit of work to do to get the entire political spectrum on board with nuclear, because we're not entirely there yet. I mean, like the Social Democrats as a party hasn't even turned fully pro yet, so we have some work to do on getting everyone on board, but we're working on it.
Yeah, but that's right, what Ia is saying. Everybody is not on board. And that's probably the most important message the government has to send during the coming 3 more years that we have, is that this is about physics now. It's not about whether you like blue or pink power plants anymore. Paradoxically, we cannot really add much more wind without also adding nuclear. And that doesn't compute to many people, because they were seen as competitors. They're not. We have to strengthen the system to add more wind to it, and then we can add more wind, obviously.
One of the linchpin issues around nuclear energy that we hear a lot about that can damage its popularity amongst the public is around nuclear waste. And Daniel, I know that you have a lot of experience working in this, having been at the Swedish Nuclear Fuel and Waste Management Company. I'm curious if you think this is one of those issues that is holding back public support in Sweden, which is surprising given that Sweden is one of the few countries that has even recently agreed on a long-term storage facility, one of the few that has found some way forward for long-term storage of spent fuel.
Well, we started off in 1974, I think it was, with a government inquiry on how to do this, and then it was decided that the industry was responsible. The industry, we developed a method, and then after about 10 years of scrutinizing the methods with the authorities and in the environmental court, a permit was granted about 2 years ago by the government, and now there is a stepwise process to assure that this follows what's been agreed upon and that the method works as intended. So now I don't really think that there is, I don't know what Ia says, you'll get a chance to comment, but I don't think that people really sees this as an issue anymore. There is a decision, we have a method, we spent almost 50 years developing it and turning everything upside down, looking at it from every angle, so I think people are quite content with this.
Ia, would you agree?
I mean, I'm content with it, but that's because I've read the plan. If I like called up my friends right now, I think there is 2 of them that know what the waste repository is, and that's only because I have ranted to them about it. I don't think a single person under 30 has a, except for our own environmental minister, has a clue what's going on with that waste repository. Like, absolutely, it's a great plan, and like the waste repository, it's going to be great, and like it's got all the technological details, but I'm lacking like an awareness raising campaign to all the high schools in Sweden. That's what I want right now.
Can you make that happen, Daniel?
Well, maybe that's necessary. Then again, this has been the most thorough democratic process that we've ever seen, and I'm not so sure that anyone else has seen something like it either. We've been educating people in the communities affected for decades. They've been involved in every part of the decision. Boards elected by the communities have been scrutinizing every detail, and they have had a chance to veto everything in the end. There has been maybe before you went to school then, but when I was in school, this was a big thing for many years. So, plus the government has had a chance to change the path of the development every 3 years. So there was like a green light from the government to go ahead for the coming 3 years since the 80s. So I think everybody has had a chance to be on board, and I don't really see. We even paid the environmental NGOs to oppose it, to employ people to dig into the details and try to figure out what could possibly be missing. So, well, I think we did a decent job.
I love the confidence in it, and it certainly is impressive. We had another question up here in the front. Do you want to ask, or was it covered?
No, I want to ask, I'm very fascinated with what China is doing with thorium reactors. And from what I understand in the US, if you recycle all the nuclear waste, you can power US for up to 150 years or something like that. I'm just wondering, from what Sweden did in the 80s versus how we want to rebuild it now, will there be any elements of innovation, for example, where some of that waste could also be recycled, etc., or that we, for example, have thorium-type reactors, as China is rolling out now in their strategies?
I wrote my PhD on this, so don't get me started. We'll be here not for 1 week, but for 2. But of course, there will be innovation, and what I always say is we produce enough spent fuel to start advanced reactors, even though we have a repository. So we're not going to have a lack of material for those the spent fuel for those reactors to start them. So that's going to be fine.
Any other questions from the audience? All right, I have another one for the panel. On the subject of durability of Sweden's policy, it's one thing to set these targets and say this is where we're going, but what do you think is necessary to stay on track and to maintain the political and public durability for meeting these very ambitious clean energy transition goals? Let's start with Ia.
I think an absolutely vital part is making sure that the public awareness about the goal is very high, and making sure that the public is also part of holding the political system and the government accountable to preserving these goals, which will also ensure continuity over election cycles, which is important because whatever our political friends here say, the world doesn't end at the next election cycle. So it's good to keep that continuity going, and that is done through the populace and through the civil society and through us normal people. So that is what I think is really vital, that there is a public-based pressure to keep it going, and that we simply also see a large-scale economic investment quite soon. Because once the money is in it, then like no self-respecting politicians is going to be like, I'm going to stop that, but we've already spent all the money. Like that's not going to happen. So I think that's like, at least from my perspective, that would be what's like most vital to make sure that this doesn't just crash and burn in a paperwork pile somewhere.
Well, and on the money point, one of the main points of the nuclear roadmap was the government guarantee of credit guarantees of around 35 billion euros, but an acknowledgement that there needed to be other risk-sharing financing models as part of this plan. So with that in mind, Simon, do you want to answer the question next?
Yeah, well, there's been this discussion on the longevity of agreement around nuclear, and whether a future government would change it, would then tear up stop the construction of those nuclear power plants. And in response to this, many people have demanded a broader political agreement around the energy system, which I actually don't think is necessary. We've had several political agreements, and the downside of these political agreements is you end up with this like least common denominator agreements that don't actually achieve much. And they also have a very short half-life, if you will, because we've had them several times, 1997, 2016, 2006. We've had so many agreements and they always fall apart. Here, I think it's a slight deficiency in the Swedish political system that you often oppose what the other side has done after 4 years. So if you look at the UK, for example, they often instead have these white papers that do have this broad political support, but they also have a culture of once there's a consensus on this policy, you don't really oppose it. I know the Swedish government now is bringing forward a new energy proposition, and hopefully that will be something similar to the UK system that the parties can stand behind jointly. But that's more like a roadmap for Sweden and not you sign some kind of waiver where everyone gets what they want and nothing gets done.
Daniel, let's turn to you.
Sorry, and on the credit guarantees, of course, that's a very efficient economic mechanism to tie the captain to the ship, because if a future government decides to stop a nuclear project, well, then they sit there with the final debt, because they are the final guarantee.
Right. Daniel, let's turn to you, and then we had another audience question. Do you want to ask your question first, and then we can lump it into Daniel's answer as well? Can we hand him a mic here? Thanks, Ia.
Thank you. It's actually a good timing, because I was a question about financing. So I was just intrigued as to, you talked about public consensus and generally the support for the program, but how have you made that argument with regards to financing and new nuclear? That's obviously going to be the big roadblock for most sort of economies in the current climate. I was intrigued as to how you made that argument publicly.
So the question is really, how do you maintain support under risk sharing? So the question, to me, it's rather simple. We have three means of energy that we can expand at a massive scale, which are also fossil free, and that's solar, it's wind, and it's nuclear. And only one of those is dispatchable, and we don't know yet of any power system which lacks a sufficient share of dispatchable capacity. So unless you add nuclear, you're stuck with fossil fuels. I claim that we have to stop talking about reducing emissions, because this is not about reducing emissions, this is about eliminating emissions. And to reach all the way to zero, you need to plan from the start, because zero is so much different than reducing. Eliminating is something else. Everybody, everywhere, in every country, in every sector has to look at their emissions and see how can I phase those out. Now, when doing that, and knowing that the only source of dispatchable energy you have is nuclear, then it's a physical problem. It's not really. If we want to live in a high energy society, which I think we cannot choose not to do, because people would never accept it, because the chance of meeting your grandchildren's children depends on a high energy society, as does your cancer treatment or the food on your table. So people will never accept something else, so that's what we have to plan for. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think we can gain support for building a working power system globally. Yes.
Great. I have been given the sign that we actually need to wrap up. So there has been a lot of promising lessons that I think we can take with Sweden's ambitious plans around nuclear. And I'm sure any of our three panelists here would be happy to answer other questions after the panel. So please come up and say hello. Thank you. A round of applause for our panelists, and I appreciate for all of you listening.